And we're back on the Newsmaker show. Brian O'Neill on now with Dr. Gary Ostrower, longtime Alfred history professor. Dr. Ostrower, last night, President Donald Trump gave a press conference. Didn't take any questions. Then he said, I have to go somewhere very special. Then he walked through, and the Secret Service walked around him and ahead of him and behind him. He walked through Lafayette Park, where they had heard explosion sounds during Trump's presser. Then he walked up to St. John's Church and held a Bible up in the air and said, America will be great again. Your thoughts on what happened last night and what's going on in general?
This is a very, very consequential period in American history. We have, in a way, we've not had this ever. I mean, during the, perhaps during the Civil War, when certain kinds of liberties were suspended by the Union government in light of the insurrection. And then, of course, but we haven't had it even during the First World War. There was a good deal of abuse of civil liberties during the First World War. Among other things, you couldn't even play Beethoven or other German composers in concert halls. The teaching of German in public schools was suspended. But and there was also something called the Sedition Act, which was passed, which did allow for placing into custody individuals who were viewed as disloyal. A good example would be the head of the Socialist Party back in that period, who was nonviolent, but who was calling for, he denounced American participation in the war after 1917. His name is Eugene Debs, and he was put into jail for about 3 years or so. During the Second World War, there were abuses. We all know what happened to Japanese Americans during the Second World War. And, of course, you had the McCarthy period. So, I mean, in many ways, American history has kind of veered between periods of some repression and, of course, exactly the opposite, the assertion of civil liberties, the defense of constitutional freedoms and whatnot. But what's happening right now, I think, is, in some ways even more fearful, precisely because you have a president who is himself in no way, I think, conversant with the Constitution. He doesn't seem to respect the Constitution. I doubt whether he's ever read the Constitution. And he gives a speech, as he did last night. Senator Senator Wyden from Oregon said last night, he tweeted last night, the fascist speech Donald Trump just delivered verged on a declaration of war against American citizens. He said, I fear for our country tonight, and I will not stop defending America against Trump's assault. And I think that there's a good deal of truth to what Wyden is saying. So here you had yesterday, for instance, a peaceful, and it unquestionably was a peaceful demonstration in Washington in Lafayette Park, which is right across from the White House. There was no sense in which people were not armed, they were not threatening the police or whatever. But Donald Trump wanted to have a photo op in front of a church, which is also right next door. It's called St. John's Episcopal Church. He wanted this photo op, and the reason he wanted the photo op is because he was embarrassed because of stories that he had been placed down into the White House bunker underneath the White House 2 days earlier. That made him look, quote, weak. This is a guy who fears looking weak more probably than he fears any other single thing in life. And so he wanted to show that he could move outside of the White House, and he was going to do that by showing up in front of St. John's Church with a Bible. A Bible I suspect that he has never read, but, we don't really know that. In either case, the police were ordered to remove the demonstrators. They fired rubber bullets at the demonstrators. They shot tear gas at the demonstrators. We have a right to protest in this country. The Constitution guarantees us a right of free speech. It guarantees us a right to dissent. And yet here you had an assault against the right of dissent in ways I think that should worry all of us at this point. So sure, there has been disorder in cities. There has been violence in cities. We know what happened in Rochester and in Buffalo. We don't know who was responsible for that violence. It could have been white supremacists. It could have been Antifa. We have no idea at this point who is responsible for this. But what I do know is that the president has a responsibility to act within the law. The president has a responsibility to respect the Constitution. He took an oath to defend that Constitution. And I think that all of us, as I said a moment ago, have plenty to fear in light of the way in which this president is conducting himself.
Now, you talked about tear gas being used, Dr. Ostrower at Lafayette Park. During the last night's press conference, there were explosion sounds heard frequently while the president was speaking. Are you saying that that's what that was tear gas?
I have no idea what those explosions were. They're loud sounds. I simply don't know.
Okay.
And there's a lot that we don't know. I mean, maybe someday there'll be an investigation, and historians certainly are going to investigate this in later years. But historians are kind of patient. We may not actually do this for 10 years or 20 years or even 30 years afterwards. What I do know is that people have a right to protest. If you have 900 people who are protesting peacefully, within the law, and you have one or two who are breaking windows, we know exactly what the media is going to focus on. But we also know the way in which the president is going to use those one or two to, I think, abridge the real freedoms, the constitutional protections that the other 900 have. Until we know what's going on, until we know what the situation is, I think there's no reason to, to draw final conclusions. And let me say one other thing, which has to do with the piece of legislation that was passed by Congress way back about, over 200 years ago, about 217 years ago, or 213 years ago. It's called the Insurrection Act of 1807. It was passed about 5 years before the War of 1812 began. And it gives the President of the United States the right, when requested by a state legislature or governor, it gives him the right to federalize the National Guard, and it gives him the right to utilize armed forces under certain circumstances. Normally, armed forces are used abroad, not at home. Okay, we have police departments, we have federal marshals, we have the FBI, we have the National Guard and so forth who can utilize those things at home. But in 1807, the federal government was given certain powers to utilize it. The president, in other words, could enforce this Insurrection Act. But he was given that right to do so, and I'm going to quote here, when requested by a state legislature or governor to address an insurrection against the state. That's in federal law. He was given that power after being requested by the state's legislature or governor to address an insurrection against the federal government or hindering the execution of laws. Now, this Insurrection Act has been occasionally used. It was certainly used, occasionally during the 19th century. It was used during Hurricane Hugo in 1988. It was used again, I might add, during Katrina in 2005. So, and I might add, by the way, that it was used in 1992 during the Rodney King riots in Los Angeles. So it's not as if this measure has never been used, but there are restrictions. The president can't use it at will. It is, dependent on the request of the state legislature or the governor. And I might add, by the way, that after 2005, after Hurricane Katrina, the act was amended to explicitly allow any emergency hindering the enforcement of laws, regardless of the state consent. In other words, regardless of whether or not the legislature requests this or the governor requests this. And yet that was soon rescinded, that clause, that was soon rescinded about when all 50 state governors, this is in 2008, just about 12 years ago, when all 50 state governors issued a joint statement against it. And the changes, therefore, were repealed as a result of that in January of 2008. So the president doesn't have the right to, send the army into a state. It doesn't have the right to send the army into Minneapolis or Houston or Brooklyn or any place else on his own. The president, in other words, is limited by law. But I think what we're seeing with President Trump is a president who does not want to be limited by law, and that's the kind of thing that I'm concerned about.
Today in history, June 2nd, 1865, end of the Civil War. Dr. Ostrower, one late-night talk show host wonders if we're heading towards Civil War. What do you think?
Well, I certainly hope we're not. But when, there are white supremacist groups that want nothing less than a civil war. They want to see a race war. Are they responsible for some of the violence that we have seen in the cities? I'm not talking about the peaceful protests. I'm talking about the actual violence. And the answer is, we don't know. Was it Antifa? We do not know. Could we be, bruising toward a civil war? I think that, once again, we really don't know. But there is certainly reason to worry about it. For a long, long time, for most of our 200 and, almost 30 years or so of national existence, we have taken for granted that the opposition, the political opposition, the Federalist Party versus the Republican Party, that is the first Republican Party, or the current Republican Party and the Democratic Party, whether we're talking about the administration of Woodrow Wilson or Franklin Roosevelt or John Kennedy, or during the Vietnam War, Lyndon Johnson. We may have not liked a lot of what the opposition was arguing, but we took their loyalty for granted. Okay? We took their loyalty for granted. We called it, the loyal opposition. I see that breaking down. I think that, social media is responsible for some of this. I think that the polarization that has been certainly fueled by Fox News has been responsible for some of this. And so a lot of Republicans don't see Democrats or liberals as loyal anymore. And by the same token, there are plenty of liberals and Democrats who are viewing Republicans, particularly Republicans like Donald Trump, as really, violating the terms of the Constitution itself. Can civil war be a result of that kind of polarization, of that kind of divisiveness? I think the answer is yes. I think it's it's certainly a possibility in a way that I don't think it was a possibility 20 or 30 years ago. And I think there's one other thing that one should take into account in respect to the question that you've just asked. There's a lot of there's certainly been a great deal of violence and disruption and so forth, instability that we've seen just in the last week. And it's very, very important to maintain order. I think that most of us would agree with that. But we have to take into account, and here I want to go back to something that Assemblywoman Burns was saying, not very long ago on this very, very program. She made the point that people of color who have lived in cities have been abused for a long, long time, and it's led to a great deal of rage. Let's not lose sight of the fact that what happened to George Floyd in Minneapolis is not an isolated incident. We've seen this in Ferguson, Missouri. We've seen it in Baltimore. We've seen it in Charleston. We've seen it in New Orleans. We've seen it in Houston. Okay? There are legitimate complaints. There are legitimate fears for their own security. If a government exists, it exists to provide people security. I mean, we go all the way back to the 17th century, and the philosophers like Thomas Hobbes and like John Locke, what they're arguing is that governments exist to provide, to secure the people, and to guarantee our rights. And when those rights are not guaranteed, when unarmed black people are killed the way they have been killed over the last few years, sure, it's going to lead to rage. And I find so interesting that in the president's comments last night, not once did he refer to the legitimate grievances that people have, white and black, in respect to this whole subject of public safety.
We're going to take a quick break and then check the forecast. We'll be right back with Dr. Ostrower.
Springwater Amish Workshop in Springwater is once again open for business. Summer living is here. Enhance your outdoor living spaces with quality constructed Amish-made furniture and accessories of polyvinyl or southern yellow pressure-treated pine. Do your baby chicks need a home? Springwater Amish Workshop has chicken coops in stock. 2020 storage sheds and gazebos are arriving weekly, or they can order just what you want. That's Springwater Amish Workshop, 7936 Mill Street, that's Route 15, in Springwater. And check out their website, springwateramishworkshop.com, to see what they can do.
Courts Auto Collision.
Hi, Bill.
Never seen an insurance job we both can't make money on yet.
Bill?
And yes, I still have a free loaner car.
Bill, I just called to...
Courts Auto Collision, Day Route 36, south of Canisteel, 698-9900. Online at McCourtsCollision.com.
Bill, for the first time in my life, you have left me speechless.
I am Bill McCourt.
Wow.
Checking in now with meteorologist Gary Best, who says it's going to get a little rainy before it gets more sunny.
That is correct. Looks like showers coming up through tonight and tomorrow, Brian, and then some sunshine and summer warmth should return by Thursday. Today's sunrise was at 5:35. It'll set at 8:43. However, we're not going to see too much sun out there. A lot of clouds, at least through this morning. Scattered showers will continue. High temperature, upper 60s. And tonight, scattered showers and thunderstorms and mild, low 60s overnight. Tomorrow, it warms up to 74 to 78. Again, a lot of clouds with a few showers and thunderstorms. But Thursday should be rain-free, partly sunny and much warmer. Temperatures in the low 80s Thursday afternoon.
Back with Dr. Gary Ostrower here live on the Newsmaker show. Dr. Ostrower, this day in history, like we said earlier, the Civil War came to an end. Was Lincoln still alive when the Civil War ended, Dr. Ostrower?
Lincoln was alive when the Civil War ended. Now, wait a minute. I want to stop.
Oh, you want more to say?
No. The Civil War ended in April, not in June. Okay, I don't remember the exact date, but I believe it was the 9th of April, and then about 5 or 6 days later, Lincoln was assassinated. Yes, Lincoln was alive when the Civil War ended, and then, of course, John Wilkes Booth ended Lincoln's life just about less than a week later. Now, there were people in the South. Remember, they didn't have the kind of communication that we take for granted today. There were units of the Confederate Army that didn't fully know that the Civil War had ended. But Lee's surrender was in April of 1865, and of course, Lincoln's assassination, as I say, came a few days later.
Okay, well, just reading off the History Channel's website, which also says this day in 1953, Queen Elizabeth II was coronated. Your thoughts on Queen Elizabeth, Dr. Ostrower?
Well, she's been queen longer than any other person in British history, even longer than Queen Victoria, who had served for over 60 years. Look, I'm not sure that I have a very strong opinion about Queen Elizabeth per se, other than to say that she has a sense of decency, she has a sense of decorum. I think she was very, very uncomfortable when she was visited by President Trump, last year in 2018. And that's because Trump does not, how shall I put it, he doesn't respect norms, and he doesn't respect, among other things, even, NATO and so forth, some of the very agreements, the alliances that the Americans have had with other countries. But, she is a symbol, if you will. I mean, that's what a queen has become. She has very, very little authority. If the British House of Commons tomorrow voted to eliminate the monarchy, the Queen would have no choice but to sign that legislation ending her queenship, ending the monarchy itself. So, the Queen has become a figurehead. The British, monarch, the British crown has lost authority steadily ever since 1688. It was in 1688 that Britain experienced something called the Glorious Revolution of 1688. They call it the Glorious Revolution in part because it was not quite bloodless, but almost bloodless. I think only about 5 people were killed during the revolution. But what happened during that revolution is that the king at that time, James II, who he was Catholic. He had not a son, so many of the British assumed that once James died, Britain would revert back to Protestant rule. and then his wife had a son, and all of a sudden the possibility of Catholic rule in Britain became certainly a real possibility, long-term possibility. And so members of Parliament revolted. They led this. They created this so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688. He fled. A Protestant was invited in to rule Britain from the Netherlands. His name was King William. Her name was Queen Mary. And it established once and for all, and this is, I think, the real importance of this revolution, the way it has resonance today, it established the principle of parliamentary supremacy. They established the principle, in other words, that the king was not above the law. And the Americans, who were colonists at that time, fully accepted the framework of the Glorious Revolution of 1688, and we are going to build those ideas into our Constitution, not the least of which is that no one is above the law, not the President of the United States, not the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. No one is above the law. President Trump does not fully accept that. President Trump argues that he is above the law, and I think you see it in the way in which, for instance, he could not be indicted, even though the Mueller investigation had clearly showed that in 10 different ways he had obstructed justice just within the past 3 years.
Well, with that, we have to go. Dr. Gary Ostrower, I want to thank you so much for calling in.
Thank you very much, Brian, and I'll talk to you guys next week.